April 1st, 2026. A rocket launches from Florida, bound for the moon. The world stops. That same day, in Washington, someone signed the documents to destroy the agency that launched it. This is the story of the biggest NASA scandal in history, with billions wasted, whistleblowers silenced, and a space race the United States may be on the verge of losing to China. And the worst part? It was done in plain sight.
To understand the full scale of this scandal, you first need to understand what NASA is and what it means to the world. We're not just talking about rockets and spacesuits. NASA is, arguably, the scientific project with the greatest economic return ever funded by any government in modern history. Every dollar invested in the agency has historically generated between $7 and $14 in direct returns for the American economy. GPS, solar panels, MRI machines, clean water filters, digital cameras, memory foam, even modern fire detection systems trace their origins to technology developed by NASA. All of it came from programs that many people considered, at the time, a waste of public money. But NASA was never just about technology. It was power. It was a symbol. It was proof that the United States was capable of doing the impossible, and doing it first. Go back to 1957. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in history. It's a total shock to Washington. Suddenly, the enemy is in space. Suddenly, American superiority is no longer guaranteed. Congress panics, and in 1958, NASA is born, created not out of love for science, but out of strategic necessity, out of fear. The space race was not a scientific adventure. It was a war fought 250 miles above the Earth, and the United States won it. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. The entire world watched, and for the first time in history, a human being looked down and saw the whole Earth as a small, fragile object suspended in nothing. That image changed everything: philosophy, environmentalism, politics, the way humanity saw itself. But here's what rarely gets told. After Apollo, NASA entered a long period of drift. Without the pressure of the Soviet race, the U.S. Congress systematically cut the budget year after year. In 1966, NASA received 4.4% of the federal budget, the equivalent of more than $50 billion in today's dollars. By 2024, it received just 0.4%, less than half of 1%. For decades, the agency survived on the Space Shuttle, a program that, in practice, never left Earth's orbit. Glorious on screen, limited in ambition, and devastatingly expensive. Each launch cost around $1.5 billion from a program that had promised to do it for $60 million. Then came the accidents. Challenger in 1986, Columbia in 2003, 14 astronauts dead, 2 programs destroyed, and an agency that was beginning to lose not just rockets, but credibility. In 2004, President George W. Bush announces the Constellation program, back to the moon, then Mars. Budgets approved, contracts signed, companies hired. In 2010, Barack Obama cancels everything. The program was deemed too expensive and too slow. More than $9 billion spent, 0 launches. It is in this context of decades of broken promises, cut budgets, and wasted public money that in 2011, the program at the center of everything that follows is born. They called it the Space Launch System, the rocket that would carry humanity back to the moon, the most expensive rocket in history. And the story of its construction is itself a scandal within a scandal. Washington, D.C. Congress gives NASA a direct order: build a new super heavy lift rocket. The space shuttle is being retired. The Constellation program has been canceled. We need something new, something that carries humans beyond Earth's orbit for the first time since Apollo. The order had an official name: Space Launch System. the SLS, and it had a date. The first launch was supposed to happen in 2016. But before understanding what went wrong, and everything went wrong, you need to understand how this contract was structured, because this is where the story of the SLS stops being a story about engineering and becomes a story about power, money, and impunity. NASA did not choose the company to build the rocket through an open, competitive bidding process. The contract was negotiated directly with Boeing, the same company that had already worked on the Space Shuttle, the Constellation program, and virtually every major American space program of the past several decades. A relationship so long and so deep between client and supplier that in practice, Boeing knew it would never truly be penalized for failure. The contract had an initial value of $4.2 billion, and it was a cost-plus contract, meaning costs plus a guaranteed profit margin. In plain terms, if costs go up, NASA pays the difference. If the project falls behind, NASA absorbs the loss. Boeing, in any scenario, gets paid. It's the kind of contract that NASA's own administrator would later publicly call a plague. Why cost plus? The official justification was simple. Developing cutting-edge space technology is unpredictable. The risks are enormous. No private company would accept taking on that risk alone under a fixed-price contract. There was some truth to this, but there was also another truth, far less convenient. Cost-plus contracts create a perverse incentive. The longer the project runs, the more hours get billed. The higher the costs climb, the larger the base on which the profit margin is calculated. In theory, a well-managed company shouldn't exploit this. In practice, with a client like the federal government, with budgets approved by Congress and political pressure not to cancel projects that employ thousands of people in electorally important states, the temptation was enormous, and the numbers speak for themselves. In 2018, just 2 years after the originally planned launch date, a NASA Inspector General report revealed the true state of the program. Boeing had already spent $11.9 billion. The original contract was $4.2 billion, more than double, and the rocket still wasn't ready. But the most disturbing finding in the report wasn't that. It was this. NASA could not determine the actual cost of building a single rocket. Why? Because Boeing had bundled 3 distinct phases of work, the first and second rocket cores, plus a more powerful upper stage, into a single budget line item. Everything mixed together, impossible to audit separately. The report was explicit. NASA lacks visibility into the Boeing contract costs because all activities are grouped under the same budget line item, making it impossible to determine the cost of a single core stage. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a government agency that spent more than $11 billion in public money and didn't know with any precision how much it cost to build what it had paid for. This didn't happen by accident. The contract structure was designed to make accountability difficult, and the people approving that structure were the same people later evaluating Boeing's performance. So how did NASA rate Boeing's performance between 2013 and 2017, the years when delays piled up and costs spiraled? Very good to excellent, every single year without exception. And based on those evaluations, it paid Boeing $234 million in performance bonuses, $234 million to a company that delayed the project by years and doubled the costs. In any other context, this would be called corruption. Here, it was called federal contract management. But there was yet another layer to this scandal within a scandal, one that was discovered later and that reveals just how far the NASA-Boeing relationship went to protect its own interests. In 2020, an Inspector General report revealed that NASA had moved $889 million of SLS booster-related costs off the project's official budget without updating the public numbers. The goal was simple: keep the official cost overrun below 30%, because above that threshold, NASA would be required to seek additional authorization from Congress. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, was blunt. NASA's current approach for reporting cost growth misrepresents the cost performance of the program. They hid the losses. They manipulated the numbers to avoid accountability. In a private bank, this would be called accounting fraud. Here, it was just another quarter of federal contract management. And while all of this was happening behind the scenes, while the reports piled up, while the years passed and the rocket never left the ground, there was one question nobody in Washington wanted to answer out loud. If the SLS was this expensive, this delayed, and this badly managed, why did nobody cancel it? The answer isn't in the engineering, it's in the politics, and it's in a very specific electoral map that will explain everything that follows. To understand why nobody canceled the SLS, you need to understand one fundamental thing about how public money works in Washington. Federal contracts are not just economic instruments, they are political instruments. The SLS rocket's core stage was built by Boeing at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, Louisiana. The solid rocket boosters were manufactured by Northrop Grumman in Promontory, Utah. The RS-25 engines were produced by Aerojet Rocketdyne in Sacramento, California. The Orion capsule, which would carry the astronauts, was the responsibility of Lockheed Martin, with work distributed across more than half a dozen states. In total, the SLS program had subcontractors and suppliers in more than 44 American states. 44 states. That means any senator or congressman who voted to cancel the SLS was, in practice, voting against jobs in their own district, against factories in their own constituency, against taxpayers who voted for them. The SLS wasn't just a rocket. It was an industrial jobs program disguised as a space mission, surgically spread across the American political map to make it impossible to kill. In Washington's own parlance, there was a name for this: too big to cancel. And that's exactly what happened. Year after year, Inspector General reports identified problems. Year after year, the GAO warned that the costs were unsustainable. Year after year, independent experts argued that SpaceX or Blue Origin could do the same job for a fraction of the price. And year after year, Congress approved more money for the SLS. Because senators from Louisiana defended Boeing's jobs at Michoud. Senators from Utah defended Northrop Grumman's contracts in Promontory, and so on, state by state, contract by contract, in a web of interests that made any meaningful reform practically impossible. There was even an unofficial name for the SLS in Washington's hallways: the Senate Launch System. Not because the Senate had technically designed it, but because the Senate was, in practice, its biggest defender and protector. It is in this context that in 2017, already in Trump's first administration, the Artemis program is formally born. The stated objective was clear: return to the moon before 2024, beat China, reassert American supremacy in space. Vice President Mike Pence personally announced the date in March 2019 at a National Space Council meeting. Firm voice, presidential tone: Americans will return to the moon within the next 5 years. Inside NASA, the silence that followed was deafening, because everyone knew 2024 was impossible. The rocket hadn't even flown its first uncrewed test yet. The Orion capsule had its own problems: $3.2 billion in cost overruns above projections, making it responsible for nearly 3/4 of all excess costs across the 18 largest projects in development at NASA. The spacesuit for the lunar surface hadn't even been contracted yet. A former senior NASA official later told Wired magazine, anonymously, something that stuck. Everyone knew 2024 was bullshit. Absolutely everyone. But the date was maintained publicly, because the date wasn't an engineering commitment. It was a political declaration. It was a way to pressure Congress into funding, a way to create urgency in an agency that had lost its sense of urgency decades ago.
And it worked, partially. Budgets increased, contracts expanded. SpaceX was contracted to develop a lunar landing module, the Starship HLS, in a $2.9 billion deal. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin was left out and sued NASA, alleging irregularities in the award process. The lawsuit dragged on for months. It delayed the program even further. Meanwhile, November 2022, nearly 6 years after the original planned launch date, the SLS flies for the first time, uncrewed, on a mission called Artemis I. It is technically successful. The Orion capsule orbits the moon and returns to Earth. The world applauds. But the numbers tell a different story. The program's total cost to that point, $23 billion. Each SLS launch costs $4.1 billion, more than the total development cost of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, multiplied by 8. NASA internally acknowledges that at its current pace, it cannot manage more than 1 launch per year. For context, the stated goal of the Artemis program was to establish a permanent human presence on the moon with regular missions. 1 mission per year at $4 billion per launch made that economically unviable by definition. And it was precisely here, after the apparent triumph of Artemis I, that the second phase of this scandal began, the phase that wasn't covered the same way, the phase that happened behind closed doors, in sealed meetings, in internal memos, in conversations that were never supposed to leave the buildings where they took place. Because while the public celebrated the success of the first launch, inside NASA, the signs were accumulating that the program was in quiet financial collapse. And in Washington, there were already those preparing the final blow. Not to save NASA, to rebuild it in the image of other interests. And the man who would lead that process hadn't even been appointed yet.
January 2025. Donald Trump returns to the White House for the second time. And this time, the agenda for NASA was different, more radical, more surgical, and executed with a speed that caught most people inside the agency completely off guard. The first appointment that matters is Russell Vought's nomination to lead the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. For anyone unfamiliar with this role, it's worth being clear about what it means in practice. The OMB director is the man who decides where federal money goes. It is the OMB that builds the budget proposal that then goes to Capitol Hill. It is the OMB that sets priorities, eliminates programs, and determines which agencies grow and which ones wither. Vogt was not unknown. In Trump's first administration, he had held the same position. He was already known in Washington as a committed ideologue of reducing the federal government, with the exception of military spending, which he wanted to expand dramatically. This time, he was returning with a far more defined mission. In May 2025, the Trump administration presents its budget proposal for fiscal year 2026. The numbers are historic. A 25% cut to NASA's total budget, a 47% cut to scientific funding, more than 40 active missions proposed for immediate cancellation, some already in space, operating, sending data back to Earth. The official justification used language that few expected to find in a formal government document. The SLS was described as grossly expensive. Science education programs were labeled woke STEM programming, and the overall cuts were justified by the need to refocus NASA on 2 priorities: reaching the moon before China and sending humans to Mars. The problem, repeatedly underlined by experts, is that the programs being cut were precisely the ones that made it possible to go to the moon and Mars safely. Heliophysics missions study the solar storms that can fatally irradiate a crew in transit. Planetary science programs develop the navigation models needed to land on unmapped surfaces. They cut the routes and claimed they were going to climb higher. But the real scandal wasn't in the numbers. It was in what was happening in parallel, behind the scenes. In September 2025, Senator Maria Cantwell published a report titled "The Destruction of NASA's Mission:
based on testimonies from whistleblowers who risked their careers to speak. What they revealed was serious. Vogt had been issuing secret directives to NASA since the summer, months before any budget vote in Congress. The message was unambiguous. Start shutting down projects now. Don't wait for Congress. Act as if the cuts are already law. This has a legal name, impoundment. It's when the executive branch refuses to spend money that Congress has already approved. It was declared unconstitutional in 1974 after Nixon used it systematically. And it was exactly what was happening again, 50 years later. The human impact was immediate. More than 2,600 NASA employees accepted early departure packages. Space Center directors with decades of experience went home. Projects froze. One employee told Wired anonymously, "We did the worst of all worlds. We positioned this as a race without planning to win." And it was in this context that the second decisive appointment in this story arrived. In December 2025, Trump nominated Jared Isaacman as NASA administrator. Isaacman was not a scientist. He was not an engineer. He was the founder of Shift4 Payments, a payment processing company. He was an adventurer. He was a SpaceX customer, having flown twice on Elon Musk's rockets. The new head of NASA was first and foremost a man with a deep personal and financial relationship with the company that stood to benefit most directly from the dismantling of the SLS and the opening of NASA's contracts to the private market. There was no proof of direct conspiracy, but the facts were what they were. And when with Artemis II astronauts already in space, CNN's Jake Tapper asked him directly whether he supported the proposed cuts, Isaacman answered without hesitation, "Yes, of course I do." The head of NASA, supporting the scientific dismantling of NASA, with his own astronauts 250,000 miles away, orbiting the moon.
April 1st, 2026, Cape Canaveral. The SLS lifts off with 4 astronauts on board: Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen. It is the Artemis II mission, the first time in 54 years that human beings have departed beyond Earth's orbit. The world stops. People weep in the stands. Screens fill with fire and light. And 2 days later, while the spacecraft was cutting through space toward the moon, the White House published its new budget proposal for 2027. The same cuts, the same 47% slash to scientific funding, the same 40 missions canceled for the second consecutive year, as if Congress hadn't rejected everything the year before. One expert publicly described the document as a copy-paste job with date errors because there were sections that still referenced 2026 instead of 2027. They hadn't even bothered to proofread it before publishing. The simultaneity was staggering. American astronauts breaking historical records in space. The Orion capsule reached 406,771 kilometers from Earth on April 6th, the farthest any crewed mission had ever traveled, while in Washington, the formal dismantling of the agency that had launched them was being prepared. That same April 6th, Trump called the astronauts, a classic presidential gesture. But this time, after a brief exchange of words, a prolonged silence fell on Trump's end. The astronauts waited. One of them asked, confused, "Communications check?" Trump came back on the line, blamed a 9-second delay, and ended the call by saying he wanted the astronauts' autographs when they got home. Social media exploded. The most widely shared comment simply read, "Maybe Trump was wondering whether he should tell them he's trying to cut NASA's budget by 23%. But the consequences of this NASA scandal reached far beyond the bitter humor of social media. They went beyond Washington. They went beyond the United States. Canada had an astronaut on board Artemis II, Jeremy Hansen, the first non-American to fly beyond Earth's orbit.
The entire country was proud. But Canada was also an official partner in the Gateway program, a lunar orbital space station for which it had committed years of engineering work and the development of a state-of-the-art robotic arm, the Canadarm3, valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. The Gateway was canceled by Trump in March 2026 without prior consultation with international partners. Japan was in the same position. The Japanese space agency JAXA had invested years of technical work and diplomatic capital in the Artemis partnership. With the abrupt cancellation of the Gateway, Tokyo went quiet but was deeply affected. Europe, through ESA, faced the same uncertainty. These were strategic U.S. allies who had bet on NASA as a long-term partner, and now they were all looking at Washington asking the same question. Can we really trust this? That question was becoming increasingly difficult to answer with confidence, and there was a very concrete geopolitical reason for that. While NASA imploded from within, China advanced with a discipline and consistency that stood in brutal contrast to the American chaos. The Chinese space agency doesn't share much about its programs, but the track record was unambiguous. Every proposed mission had been executed, every stated objective had been met. Tiangong, the Chinese space station, had been operational since 2022, with regular taikonaut rotations. The Chang'e 6 mission had collected samples from the far side of the moon in 2024, a feat no other nation had ever accomplished. And by late 2026, the launch of Chang'e 7 was planned, with the goal of landing at the lunar South Pole, the same region the Artemis program was targeting. One American space policy expert summarized the situation in a line that circulated widely. They've attempted some really ambitious things, and they've succeeded on the first try, every time. The U.S.-China moon race was not a political metaphor. It was a strategic reality with implications that went far beyond scientific exploration. The lunar South Pole is rich in water ice, a resource that can be converted into hydrogen and oxygen fuel, potentially making it the first gas station in the solar system. Whoever gets there first and establishes a permanent presence has an enormous logistical advantage over any future mission to Mars or beyond. It's territory, it's a resource, it's power. And the United States was dismantling the agency that could get them there first. Congress once again rejected the cuts, as it had in 2026. The final approved budget kept NASA's funding close to previous levels. The agency survived, this time. But the 2,600 employees who had left didn't come back. The programs that had been frozen for months lost data, and in some cases entire teams that had scattered into the private sector. Institutional damage is measured not only in dollars, it's measured in decades of accumulated knowledge that simply ceased to exist. And there was one final irony, perhaps the most revealing of this entire story. The program that the Trump administration wanted to protect and expand, Artemis, the race to the moon, the lunar base, the mission to Mars, depended entirely on the science it was cutting. The heliophysics missions proposed for cancellation were the ones that monitor solar storms capable of fatally irradiating a crew in transit between Earth and Mars. The planetary science programs slated for elimination were the ones developing the terrain models needed to land safely on the Martian surface. The astrophysics research being defunded produced the materials and technologies that end up incorporated into life support systems for future long-duration missions. They declared war on the science they needed to win the war they declared on China. The Artemis II astronauts returned to Earth on April 10, 2026, splashing down in the Pacific off the coast of San Diego. They were welcomed as heroes. The images circled the globe. The mission was a complete technical success. NASA was still standing, for now.
The astronauts came home. The cameras switched off. The world moved on. But NASA's story didn't end with the Artemis II splashdown. In fact, what happened in April 2026 was just the most visible chapter of a much longer and much quieter process that continues to unfold as you watch this. Because the central question of this scandal was never just about the budget. It was about the model. It was about the vision. It was about the answer to a question the United States still hasn't answered clearly. Is space exploration a public good or a private business? For decades, the answer was unambiguous. NASA existed because there were things the private market didn't do, not for lack of technical capability, but for lack of short-term financial incentive. No private company is going to invest billions of dollars to study Jupiter's magnetic field. No shareholder approves a budget to monitor asteroids that might threaten Earth 100 years from now. No board of directors funds missions whose direct economic return is zero, but whose civilizational return is incalculable. That's what public agencies are for. That's what NASA is for. But what the Trump administration proposed, and continues to propose, is a fundamental reconfiguration of this model. A NASA reduced to the essentials of human transportation, with everything else handed over to the market. A NASA that serves as an anchor client for private companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others that are emerging. A NASA that stops being a science agency and becomes, essentially, a space procurement agency. There are those who defend this model with serious arguments. SpaceX has demonstrated that the private sector can innovate faster and cheaper in certain areas. The cost per kilogram launched to low Earth orbit has dropped dramatically since SpaceX entered the market. Competition works when it exists, when it's real, and when what's being contracted is defined clearly enough to be put out to bid. But there are domains where this model simply doesn't work, and it's in those domains, fundamental science, long-range exploration, missions with no immediate commercial return, that the proposed cuts cause irreversible damage. Not damage that gets fixed when the budget goes back up. Damage measured in scattered teams, in data that was never collected, in observation windows that closed forever, in decades of accumulated knowledge that simply stopped existing. China understands this. That's why it doesn't cut its space science when it decides to expand its human exploration program. It does both in parallel, with a discipline of state that the American political system is finding increasingly difficult to replicate. And here is the most direct connection to the present, one that concerns every person watching this video, regardless of nationality. NASA is not just an American agency. It is, in practice, the backbone of international space exploration. Its climate data is used by scientists around the world. Its telescopes, Hubble, James Webb, and the Roman Space Telescope, expected to launch later in 2026, produce knowledge that belongs to all of humanity. Its asteroid detection programs monitor objects that threaten not the United States, but the planet. When NASA is weakened, the entire world becomes more vulnerable, not metaphorically, literally. And there is one final figure that is rarely mentioned in this debate, but which is perhaps the most revealing of all.
On April 6, 2026, the Artemis II crew photographed the Earth rising over the Moon, the same image as Apollo 8, 58 years later. And while that photograph traveled through space back to Earth, Washington was signing the sentence of the agency that made it possible. Congress held the line, but the employees who left didn't come back. The knowledge that was lost doesn't come back either. The question isn't whether NASA will survive, it's which NASA will survive. Tell me in the comments, do you think the United States can still win the race to the moon, or have they already handed that victory to China?